Hey, good morning, my brothers and sisters. Welcome to episode 7 in the book of 1st Thessalonians. This is season 8 of Be With Me, a daily podcast, which I'm glad to have you with me today. Yesterday, we talked about how smart and quote-unquote wise the schemey Satan is to try to thwart Paul's plans for fellowship. And then today, we're going to hear Paul willingly giving up his fellowship with Timothy for the good of the Thessalonians. In fact, I'm going to title today that Paul is obsessed/possessed by the Thessalonians. So we have a trio of missionaries, Paul, Silas, and Timothy, who write this letter. And let me read the passage. We're going to start in just the very end of 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 and then go into chapter 3. He's talking about how jazzed he is about the Thessalonians. He says, "For what is our hope or joy or crown of boasting before our Lord Jesus at his coming? Is it not you? For you are our glory and joy." All right, then this is chapter 3, verse 1. "Therefore, when we could bear it no longer, we were willing to be left behind at Athens alone. And we sent Timothy, our brother and God's co-worker in the gospel of Christ, to establish and exhort you in your faith." And then he describes this lack of fellowship, that no one be moved by these afflictions. So this is the guy that's been beaten with rods, stoned. Eventually he'll be shipwrecked, beaten a bunch more times. And he describes affliction as not any of those things. He describes affliction as being separated from the Thessalonians and separated from Timothy. All right, we have to remember back in Acts chapter 17 how this all happened. We're on the second missionary journey, which is described much more in detail in Acts chapters, all of them actually. But Acts chapter 17, they're up in Philippi and then they go to Thessalonica. A mob forms from the wicked men of the rabble and they start attacking. So they leave town, they go to Berea. Everything is great in Berea. Everybody loves in Berea, except for one problem. The people from Thessalonica, when they heard that they were down in Berea sharing the gospel, they sent a contingent down there, agitating and stirring up the crowd, so much so that the brothers there, that is the new believers in Berea, make Paul leave town because the people from Thessalonica were there persecuting him. So he goes 220 miles by sea down to Athens. So that's all in Acts chapter 17, that he is protected by the brothers of Berea and sent by way of sea. Now, of interest, he leaves Timothy and Silas there so that Christ can be formed in this early church. This is the first time they had ever had the gospel. This is the first time that the gospel was in what's considered Europe. So Paul was conducted and brought to Athens. That is, the brothers from Berea didn't leave him alone, just put him on a boat. They put him on a boat with a couple of people, plural. So Timothy and Silas stay up in Berea, Yes, they stay up in Berea, and they send Paul down to Athens. And the last instructions that Paul leaves is return to Paul as soon as you can. Timothy and Silas return to Paul down in Athens. So eventually they do return to Athens. But what Paul couldn't bear, listen to this, is when we could bear it no longer, we were willing to be left behind in Athens alone. So Paul is in Athens eventually with Paul, Timothy, and Silas. And he feels so much of a passion for the Thessalonians. He couldn't bear it anymore, and he's willing to send Timothy. And what couldn't Paul bear? The aloneness, the lack of fellowship. He's so concerned that he's ready to send one of his last, henchmen, one of the last arrows in his quiver, 220 miles back up the Macedonian peninsula to check on them. So Paul is willing to engage in temporary, long-distance fellowship with the Thessalonians by sacrificing temporary the loss of personal fellowship with Timothy. And we think that Silas actually went back up to Philippi. So that's how Paul gets left alone. So by my count, Timothy goes to Thessalonica 4 times. First of all, Timothy goes through Thessalonica with Paul and Silas. That's the first time. Then he is sent back there before the letter of Thessalonians is written. Then this letter is written, 1st Thessalonians is written by the return of Timothy back to Paul. And then Timothy returns a 3rd and a 4th time back up the Macedonian peninsula to go visit the Thessalonians in Paul's behest. And Paul is just obsessed in a good way with the Thessalonians. Listen to this. There's a couple of things. He's constantly remembered them in these prayers. He declares them as you are our joy and our glory and our affection. Secondly, he sent two letters, some of the first letters in the New Testament, maybe the first. He revisits them 2 times on the 3rd missionary journey. He's willing to leave Timothy and Silas there amidst a mob. He sends Timothy up the coast 4 or at least 3 times in 18 months to act as his eyes and ears and hands. And this is, he's not some flunky. He's really an A-team kind of a guy. And then he declares over and over again, I wanted to come to you. This is in 2:18. I wanted to come to you again and again. So what impressed me today is how much Paul cares about the Thessalonians. They are in the laser beam of his love. Unlike, I can't think of another group of people that Paul loves as much as the Thessalonians. He's so concerned with them. He's willing to go teamless that they would stay on God's team. So he's willing to give up his team so that the Thessalonians can stay on God's team. It's temporary but necessary to see Christ formed in them, that they would know God. So just the take home is, what local or maybe even distant people do you care this much about that you would boast? You are my joy. You are my crown of boasting. Lord, may we all be obsessed with a group of people like Paul is with the Thessalonians. May we be possessed in our every thought and prayer and action and commitment and resource that they are. I thank you so much for listening. I'll see you tomorrow.